Hello there. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Marche, the webinar director here at Advice Chaser. Before we introduce our guest and get started, I do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars, such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. We're thrilled to bring you today's educational presentation. Attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to go ahead and ask questions today using the chat box. The presenter will answer those queries during or after the webinar today as appropriate. If you ask a question in the chat box, go ahead and leave your contact information as well. If we can't get to your question during the event, we'll make sure someone else reaches out to you after today's event to make sure that's addressed. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. I'd love to introduce you to our presenter today. Brenda Bridges is a financial advisor, mediator, certified divorce financial analyst, retirement income certified professional, and certified divorce coach. She is also the founder of Bridging Divorce Solutions, which helps couples divorce by implementing a non-adversarial process, one that is not financially confusing and not unreasonably costly. Using alternative dispute resolution instead of or in addition to the court system means families can own their decisions and design their lives during and after divorce. Brenda and her team believe in changing the unknowns of divorce to an understandable and streamlined process, morphing fear into hope and questions into confidence. Brenda, I'm so glad to have you back, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Glad to be here. I love working with Advice Chasers. Okay. We're talking about the beginning before the beginning, really. It's what to do and things to think about as you're getting ready if you're the one who is in the marriage thinking about or wanting to ask for divorce. There are really some important steps to take before just saying, I'm out. And when you think about it, it really sets the tone for how the rest of the process unfolds. So what we wanted to walk through today are some thoughts for you to consider. And as Marche said, please feel free to jump in and ask questions at any time. If it's anything that could be considered really specific to your case, we'll take that offline. But if it's something that is general and applies to most everyone, then we'll certainly take the time to answer the questions as long as we have time. So this, I can't stress enough, I believe is the most important thing. And so often people will come to me and go, I didn't know. I wish I had known this before I started my process. I wish I had known this when I got divorced 5 years ago. Know your options. It is absolutely not the case that the only option is to hire an attorney and serve your partner. Although that's kind of the social media point of view or TV point of view that we have of divorce, you really do have choices. And those choices can be catered to fit your specific situation. Every marriage is different. Every divorce is different. So you have the option of trying to best fit the way you go through this process to your relationship with your spouse, your going to be ex-spouse, and your family. We did a whole webinar on this, I don't know, many months ago, but you'll be able to find it in the Advice Chasers website that really digs deep into the processes. Here, we're just going to spend one page on it, but I will highlight it so you can kind of see what the differences are in the modalities of going through divorce. So choices, collaborative process. Collaborative process is something that was founded in the 1980s, 1990s, actually in Minnesota by a gentleman named Stu Webb. He was an attorney who practiced family law for many, many years. And after going through the court system and litigation so much, he really just sat down and said, there's got to be a better way. Because so many of the people that he dealt with didn't need to litigate. They were making the choice to not be married anymore, but they didn't have a great degree of animosity. They were still cooperative. Thus, the collaborative process was born, and it's becoming more and more available and accessible depending on where you live, but it's definitely a growing movement. What collaborative is kind of a hybrid between mediation and litigation. We'll get to those. In the collaborative process, each person is represented by an attorney, but those attorneys are trained in alternative dispute resolution. So here's a key difference between collaborative process and anything else. Everything is goal-based and real-time. So the meetings that people are having to decide what's going to happen with their family, what is going to happen with parenting, what is going to happen with their finances is done all together. It's not done as, someone is going to say something to their attorney who picks up the phone or sends an email to the other party's attorney who then says something to them and responds in like manner. You really are talking about the things that are important to you and your family in real time in a team meeting, but you do have representation of and knowledge provided by attorneys who know the legal process in your state. Usually in a collaborative process, there is also a financial neutral and a divorce coach, and they are providing their expertise, kind of rounding out the process. The lawyers know the law. That is their job and area of expertise. Financial neutral knows the finances of divorce, which are very different than retirement planning or overall financial planning. And they can help you avoid pitfalls, but also help you be forward thinking in looking at your financial decisions to know how, as you separate your lives, it's going to impact both of you. And if you have children, your children. The divorce coach is there in the process to kind of be the business manager of everything. And think of it this way, if you are paying an attorney $400 to $600, in some cases more an hour, do you really want them to be the one scheduling the meetings? Likewise, a divorce coach is trained to help people kind of walk through the thought processes, the parenting plans, how they're making decisions, where that isn't necessarily an attorney's area of expertise. So each party is there to support you as a team making your decisions. It is private, it is out of court. So you're controlling the budget and you're controlling your time frame, not the court system or that calendar. Okay, that was one. Mediation. There are several different types of mediation, but traditionally the mediator is going to be a neutral party who is trained in mediation, and they will help the two of you know what to discuss and walk through your decision-making process. They'll also help you when you might be at a trigger point or something that you just can't get past yourselves. They'll help you work through that. That's what they're trained to do. A key difference in mediation is a mediator is not there to tell you what to do or give advice. So if your mediator, as I am as a financial advisor, I can provide education, I can provide information, but I shouldn't, as the mediator who is neutral by definition, be saying, this is the best thing for you to do. Same thing for an attorney. If you have an attorney mediator, they should not be acting in a legal capacity. They're helping you reach agreement, but they can't say, or shouldn't say, better stated, this is what you should do, in my opinion, because that's no longer neutral. So in mediation, and you can have a mediator who helps you through the family decisions and a mediator that helps you through the financial decisions, if you want those different areas of expertise. But the mediator is helping you make the decisions. They are not advising or telling you what to do in any way, except that is also private and out of court. Next is litigation. And this is more of the, soap opera version. You've been served. I'm lawyering up. Picture, I guess, we have as a society of how divorce is handled. And it doesn't have to be that way. In some cases, you absolutely need to litigate. But oftentimes you can take it out of the court system and you can make your own decisions for you, for your money, for your family. In litigation, each party usually has an attorney. The negotiations are done through the attorney. The settlement is done through the attorney and written up through the attorney. It is often thought that litigation is decided in a courtroom, and it can be, but more often than not, it's settled by the attorneys, like upwards of 90%. But with the specter or threat of the court making the decisions kind of being held over that. If you look at these different methodologies, I guess from an expense perspective, usually, and pro se is representing yourself. So it's also called kitchen table or do-it-yourself divorce. And that's exactly what it sounds like. You are taking on the responsibility of representing yourself. One really key thing to know about pro se is if you are pro se, the legal system is looking at you as though you have a law degree. So anything you're doing representing yourself, you can't really come back later and go, oh, gee, I'm not an attorney. I didn't know that. If you are representing yourself, you're making the choice to act as a lawyer would in what is a legal process. So in those four processes, pro se is the least expensive to go through. Mediation is usually the next least expensive. Collaborative process would be the third, and litigation is usually the most expensive process. Now, that's not always going to hold true, but more often than not, that's how they stack up. If you look at them from the point of view of who's controlling it, in mediation, collaborative, and pro se, you are controlling your process and it is private. In litigation, even if you don't go to court, the hearings, the schedule of everything is being controlled by the court system and how busy the family law or court process is wherever you live. Okay, those are your options. I know that seemed like a lot, but there is a lot more if you want to look up that other webinar that we've done. In the beginning, if possible, decide with your spouse. This is what's setting the tone for how your entire divorce is going to play out. If you're in a position where trust has been, where you're not in a position of trust with your spouse, or there's an abusive situation, physical, emotional, mental, financial, this may not be the case. You might not be able to decide with your spouse. You might need to go the litigation route and have the protection of the court. But more often than not, the couples that I run across are able to, even if it's not amicable, decide what process best suits them and then use that process to go through making the decisions that they need to make in their divorce. This could be a decision that you make later. You don't have to start out with, I'm getting divorced and we're using collaborative. You and your partner don't have to start out that way. You can interview professionals. You can do your homework. You can listen to podcasts and webinars. You can figure out what best suits your family. Like I said, if you're in an abusive situation, litigation is probably the best. But it's possible that with the proper support, collaborative process might work. If you're totally amicable, there's no reason to go through litigation. That's going to increase your timing and expense. and the likelihood that there'll be more animosity because it's an adversarial process. So if you're on the same page and you have just decided we're not going to be married anymore, and we want to do this in the best way possible for us, maybe it's mediation or collaborative. Get yourself educated and match the process to your situation. And then hire your attorneys, your financial neutrals, your divorce coach, your CDFA, because different sirens, I hope that's not too distracting, because different professionals are going to have different areas of expertise. If you're in a very contentious, high stakes divorce, you probably do need a litigator who knows their way around the courtroom. If you're in an amicable process and maybe it's simpler, you don't have a lot of assets, you have grown children, things like that, then you might lean towards mediation or collaborative. In that, find the professionals that best support the process and make sure, that's super important, make sure they're trained in it. Someone might say, oh yeah, I can collaborate, I can play nice in the sandbox with other kids. But if they're not trained in the process, it's not as likely to be successful. So those are your basic options. And then we'll move on to next. Also really, really important. And doing your research on this, and I do mean research, talk to professionals, go to the Google, but look for resources that are vetted. So look for your state laws, look for your county laws, look for websites of professionals who practice in this modality, rather than going to, going to some kind of Facebook group of divorced folk, because that information is not vetted. You want to know what the rules are in your state. Some of those rules might be, is there a formula for spousal support, also called maintenance, also called alimony, or child support in your state? Most states, if not all, are going to have some kind of formula for child support. Many do not for spousal support, and spousal support can fall into 4 different categories. It can be dependent on, it's totally dependent on your situation if you're in some states. It can be totally dependent on a formula if you're in others. But if you know going into the divorce process what is the actuality where you live, you're most or more likely to be reasonable in your discussions. It's kind of like a reality check. And some kind of extreme point of view might be, oh, I've been married, 4 years and I don't earn any income. I have been stay at home and I'm expecting spousal support for the rest of my life. Look at the rules in your state. It is highly unlikely that that will be supported anywhere. It's not how our court system is working. And even if you're doing an out-of-court process or a needs-based process, that's still going to provide you kind of bumper rails for what's realistic, the what would happen if. It's also not realistic, say a couple has 3 young children, for one of the parties to say, nope, I'm not going to pay child support, just not going to do it. That's probably not going to happen. It won't be upheld by this court system. So you want to know what the guidelines or rules are where you live, because that's going to help you adapt your expectations. It will also help your spouse adapt their expectations to what the reality is. And if you find yourself then down the road not getting entrenched in a position that likely wouldn't be upheld, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and a lot of the emotions that are tied up in it. So that's knowing what is likely to happen in court, saves time, money, and stress. Basically, top line, when you start this, know the rules, know the likelihood of what happens. You can read it online. You can have discovery calls with professionals who can answer specific questions for you about what to expect. And if your expectations are realistic, then you're less likely to get in that fighting, which turns into a very expensive situation.
Yeah, we had a question here, and maybe it's a little too specific, but it was a question about what if you have a child with disabilities that can't necessarily go to regular daycare or needs extra support. Do those formulas account for that kind of thing?
Okay, it's going to be different in every state. And sometimes there was something I read recently that was, I'm going to get the number wrong, but it's ballpark. There are 3,572 counties in the United States, meaning there are 3,572 different rules for divorce. And it's true. It's state by state, but they can also be handled differently county by county. So the answer is going to be contingent upon where you live. But you can layer onto that. In my experience, those are special circumstances. So while child support will not take into account special circumstances as a guideline, it often will legally take into account special circumstances. So it's like a layer of additional detail or support that you would need to look into. And it's almost like looking at, so Illinois is a big state and it's very, very diverse, not only geographically, but demographically. The incomes around Chicago and Chicagoland area are much different than the incomes downstate in Southern Illinois. But the child support guidelines are the same for the entire state. That is when, if you're in any modality, if you're in a collaborative divorce or a mediation or litigation, it's certainly something to discuss, that the needs of having child or children in, Chicago in a private school versus downstate, because the needs are so different, it can be taken into account. So you could say for a child with special needs, and there are professionals that I know who this is what they do. They help people with special needs children craft their agreements and work through the finances of it and figure out what is, I guess, most equitable. But it is certainly something that can be addressed. The other just side note on that is it's also something to address long past the emancipation of your children. So if that child is in a special needs situation where they're going to need long-term support or support for life, you can address that in your settlement agreement. But a traditional agreement will not. A traditional agreement is going to look at an emancipation date. So the date when the kid is free to live their own life. And there's a list of rules about it. And it might be when they're 18, depending on your agreement at state. It might be when they graduate from high school. It might be when they graduate from college. It might be if they join the military or become married. But in order to have it explicitly spelled out that you're both going to provide support for this child after any of those typical, they're all grown up landmarks, you want to have it in your settlement agreement. It's definitely something to address. I hope that answered and helped.
Yeah,
It was kind of a non-answer answer, but it's just pointing out these are the things to think about that you need to address, not only immediately, but long-term as parents. The next thing to know is your finances. And frequently I'll work with people who are like, oh, I don't know this. I should know this. I should have known this. And it's like drinking from a fire hose when they're trying to get all of this stuff in order. Get some assistance, get some help, get yourself organized. And at the same time, my advice is lay aside the shame. This is something that you're going to need to handle. You're going to need to learn. It's not going to get better by ostriching, but you can methodically get the information together. You're going to need to know what you have, what your assets are. And that's from the simple things like your checking and savings account to investment accounts, retirement accounts, what real estate you own together. Could be things like HSAs, which anything that has a value to it, you're going to want to know what you had. Now, it's not unusual that one party took care of all the finances and the other took care of all the other things, maybe ran the household, raised the children. It's not unusual for there to be a like different learning curve here or discrepancies in who knows what. In order to make good decisions as you go through the process, the person who was not the family CFO is going to have to kind of ratchet up their knowledge so they know what they're deciding about. And there are plenty of resources out there to help you do that. So next point, list your questions. It's not unusual for someone to go, I know my spouse usually gets a bonus, but where do I find that information? Write it down. Or, I think they got some stock options. It's not in any of our financial records. Well, it's not because it's in their HR at their company, those records, but they haven't actually received them yet. Even if they haven't received them, they're marital property because they were earned or granted during this time. So anything that comes up that is like, let me think, I thought there was this thing, write it down because you want all of it to be disclosed. And you even want it disclosed if it's agreed upon that it's not a marital asset or that, the spouse is keeping that asset, because in your documentation of your divorce, and think of it this way, your divorce is actually a contract, just like a business contract would be. So you want it to be as sound and complete as it possibly can down the road. And by saying, oh, we talked about those stock options and we decided that my ex is going to keep them, keeps you both out of the space where down the road, life changes, someone coming back and going, oh, we never talked about those. Those are part mine. It keeps people out of court. So list everything that you can. And another thing to consider, and this is going to depend on what route you take. It's really hard to hide money. If someone has a cash business and their transactions are off the books or they do a lot of trade, different story. But for the most part, it's going to be disclosed somewhere. And if you have a professional helping you look through your tax returns and look through your W-2s or 1099s or look through business statements, you're going to find where your marital funds are or even separate funds. So to not disclose that information really just costs both of you a bunch of money to hire professionals to try to track it down. A forensic accounting can be really, really expensive. So the more you can just share information and provide access to it, because ultimately, even if it's through a subpoena or through a forensic accountant or through paying someone to comb through your 5 years of credit card bills, it's going to be disclosed. So it's easier to disclose it voluntarily than have to pay someone to find it. A little soapbox thing there, and know your finances. You also need to know what you owe. And it's important here to recognize that same as we want to document all assets and the decisions we make about them, you want to document all debt, even if it's not your debt. It still needs to be addressed. And debt can be anything from car loans to a home equity line, your student loans, mortgage. It can be a loan that one of the spouse's parents gave to put down a down payment on the house. You still want to have all of it put into your financial equation. A last point on the finances is knowing marital versus separate. And this is something that can often be confusing. And again, check your state, check your municipality for the rules there. But marital is traditionally anything acquired during the marriage. And the exception there is going to be a gift or inheritance. Separate is going to be anything that was before the marriage. And then it can start getting a little wonky and complicated, but that's your starting place. And that helps people. Say one spouse owned a house before they were married. That is not marital property, that is separate property. And then if both spouses were, living in it or paying for it or doing improvement on it, then it gets a little more complicated. But you want to have some grounding in what is ours and what case can be made for that versus what is separate. So someone had a business or an inheritance and one spouse is like, oh, that's half mine. It's probably not. You want to look at the different scenarios. Okay, that is finances. Oh, and here, working with my clients, like the bullet points are kind of a cursory list. We provide, and I think any professional will likely provide a much more detailed list. When people go, I don't know where to start, like this is overwhelming, we start just pecking away at this list. And some things are very pertinent and some things are easy to find. And others we might decide, in your case, we really don't need that or it doesn't apply. But it gives you a list overall that you then can use not only for your asset division, like how are you dividing up your property, but for forecasting what your finances are going to look like, what your net worth is going to look like, what the tax ramifications are of anything that you're talking about settlement wise. So you'll want to look for your professional to provide you basically a list of the things that you need to gather or start gathering when you're thinking about divorce. Okay, and this is part of that future forecasting. One of the things that we do first is put together a budget, and it can be tricky for people because they're used to having a budget that is one family, one household. And they need to look forward and say, what is it going to look like? What will it cost to have two families? Most likely the same or similar incomes, although that can change over time. So you want to look at what will the two household budget look like? What will your budget look like as you move through life in your own single household? One of the common mistakes I see here is the person who has not been the financial person in the marriage, really skimming down their budget, partially because they're not looking back at what has actually been spent, partially because they haven't had to handle the expenses or budget over time, and partially, honestly, because they're like, oh no, I can scrape by, like I can do this for less. You really want to start at a point for both of you where what would it look like to maintain the same standard of living moving forward for both of you? And then know that's likely to be scaled back. Not always. Sometimes people have the means to maintain those two households and the same standard of living, but it lets you know what baseline is, and then it lets you be thoughtful and mindful about where you're making adjustments or where maybe you cannot make adjustments. And some of those places, silly as it might sound, are like phone service. To have one phone line versus 5 phone lines can cost very similar, but having 2 separate accounts might be double. Same thing with health insurance. That can be another big factor in budgets, but you want to look at in the future, what will it cost for both of you? Timing. And this is one of the reasons that we are talking about this now is people often decide when they will tell their spouse about their desire to separate from their marriage, to move on based on a holiday. It's usually, I'm going to get past this landmark and then I will tell them. So we're in that space right now where we're going through Thanksgiving, the winter holidays, into a new year. And frequently people will go, for the family, for the tradition, because they don't want to rock the boat, will go through the holiday season. And then January hits, like, boom, now is the time. I made it through that one last holiday. And in that there's a seasonality to divorce, getting through the holidays, and then January is one, getting through the summer when children are off school, even up through college, and then starting the process in the fall is another. By being mindful of it, it helps you kind of look a little deeper into what the motivations are. And I'm not saying, oh, rethink it. Is this being triggered by the holidays? If you look at this last bullet point on this page, the traditional lag time, if you will, between one spouse and another is 2 years. sometimes up to 5, sometimes longer, but research backed 2 years, meaning if one spouse wants a divorce, they've likely been thinking about it, seriously thinking about it for 2 years' time before they actually tell their spouse or declare that they want to move on from the marriage. So all of that saying, if you're in this space in this like highly emotional holiday season and you're waiting until the timing is better, it is absolutely normal. What you can do is be mindful in a way that you're both getting your ducks in a row, like thinking about some of those things. What process is best for you? What would your financial situation be? What is your access? Should you start gathering information? Should you start attending webinars such as this or looking up the rules where you live? And yes, absolutely start going through those. I would also suggest that you're not looking at the holidays, or let's put it this way, to be aware of the holidays as triggering events. Sometimes if you're coming at this with the mindset of this is the last time I have to, go to Aunt Zelda's and be uncomfortable because this has been horrible in my whole holiday experience over my 27 years of marriage. Like there are a lot of triggering events in the holidays. There are triggering events if you're not thinking about divorce. If you're thinking about divorce, it's amping it up all the more. I would suggest try to be mindful of it. If you have a support system outside of those events, try to enlist that. Whether it's a friend before or after, what that thing is that is going to get under your skin. Try your best to go through. If you've made the decision, like, I'm thinking about this now, I've pretty much made up my mind, I'm going to get through the holidays. Follow through on that, figuring how you're going to do that. So you don't find yourself in this position where like it's the last straw and you're blurting out, okay, I want a divorce. This is it. Because again, as we talked about in the very beginning, that will set the tone for the entire process. And you can just put yourself in that place. If you are at work and a process server shows up and you're not expecting it, and in front of all your colleagues, they do you've been served, versus you have a quiet and thoughtful conversation with your spouse that's fact-based, that is, I need to move on from this marriage. You can just see how the tone of either of those situations will set the tone for what happens next. And on to telling your spouse. These are my guidelines that I share with people and have written on them. And I think this is incredibly important. If you are the one who wants the divorce, the more you can think through and be empathetic to your spouse. And, you might be very angry. You might not, no good marriage ends in divorce. You might be contentious. You might have all this emotion, but if you can think through what your spouse is expecting and tailor your message to it away their needs, because that is going to help you as well. And it will help your process as it unfolds. Divorce is hard. There is no like, ooh, this is just a fun thing. Divorce is a difficult thing to go through. There are really hard decisions to be made. Even the most amicable divorces have rough spots as they go through this process. When you're telling your spouse, consider your kids shouldn't be there. If you have, depending on the ages of your children, if they're younger, see if they can be at grandparents' or aunt's house or somewhere else. If they're older, can they have a sleepover at a friend's house? Arrange that they are not where you are telling your spouse, because it's between you and you're going to be X. And it's really important not to engage the kids when they don't need to be. Don't do it in a public place. This is a frequent mistake, and people will think, I'm going to tell them in a coffee shop because that's public and then they can't explode. And while that's understandable, especially if it's a volatile relationship, you're layering on if that is the case. If you do it in a public place, especially if the spouse is not expecting that they're being informed that their marriage is over, they're in a position where, because of societal norms, there's shame and guilt and exposure there. So they might be experiencing emotions that they would be better able to handle and demonstrate if you were in a private place, but they can't. There's also the possibility that, your neighbor is having coffee next door, and it just becomes a lot stickier if you decide to use a public place. And the thought that it's going to be better because they can't explode at me, it might work in the moment, but it might have a lot of backlash down the road. So just consider making sure that you're giving them the respect of telling them this really important life decision in a place where they're not exposed publicly. Another really important thing to remember is you're not in a place where you're trying to fix anything. You're not airing grievances. If you're saying definitively you do want a divorce, you want to move forward, it's not because you did this and because I did this and the because. It's not the blame game. It's at a point where it transitions into, this is a factual arrangement where we're going to try to work it out as best we can moving forward, but we're not trying to fix all the things that have bothered each other about each other as you move into this. One thing to try to remember, I would say, from the time you tell your spouse that you want a divorce all the way through your process and probably beyond, is just try to remember brief, informative, respectful, and firm. And in that brief, you don't need to layer on detail or add any color to your commentary. You just need to tell them what you need to tell them. That's the informative part. Be respectful. You could say friendly, but at least respectful, and be firm. If you have made this decision, don't lay it out there or hang out there that, yeah, but maybe we can talk about it and maybe it will be different. If that's where you are, fine. But if you are certain, it really isn't helpful to try to ease into telling them you want a divorce. Just try to remember that, be as factual as you can, informative, respectful, and firm. So you have boundaries, and then leave. You can, again, go to a friend's house, spend the night in a hotel, whatever makes the most sense for you, but remove yourself and let them have time to process, especially if you think this has been a surprise. Let them call the support in that they need. Let them get used to the idea, come up with their questions, grieve, cry, whatever they need to do. If you are there, you're not doing the brief part, right? It's stretching out the process and allowing more time to dig into the conversation or why of it, which oftentimes kind of degenerates into that, those arguments that are patterns that we repeat and have repeated into the marriage. If you can just say, this is my decision, we really don't need to discuss why. I am certain of it. I want to let you know, and now I'm going to give you time to think it through. The kids are at grandma's house and I will be back tomorrow and we can talk about this. However you phrase it, think of that as guidelines. Really important here, have backup if safety is a concern. So if you are in an abusive situation, you're concerned about violence, have someone there, not with you as you tell your spouse, but at the door, so that after you tell them, you've got a backup person who can then be there and escort you to the next safe place. And like I said, give them time to think, give them time to process, give them time to work through what they just heard on their own time. Kids, also very important throughout the entire process and co-parenting and beyond. Thoughts on this? Sometimes being authentic is more important than protecting them from what is happening. Our inclination as parents is usually to insulate our children, to make sure they're safe. If divorce is happening, it's happening. So that is the authentic part of it. Protecting them and pretending like everything is going to be the same is probably not necessarily what they need, because it will not be the same. And in a way, by trying to, I guess, sugarcoat it, you're setting them up for a bigger fall. If the message they're hearing is nothing will change, nothing will change, nothing will change, and then everything changes, it's a lot harder to transition than we love you and things will change and we're going to support you and we're going to inform you and we're going to listen to you and oh yes, we love you. But be realistic with them, and to the degree that they can handle the information about the changes, share that with them. But be really respectful of age appropriate, where they are. Go see a children's counselor to help guide you through this, if you have the means and access. And then the don'ts of this, don't alienate your kids from the other parent. Don't parentalize your kids, like using them as a fill-in. Don't stick them in the middle or make them the communicators. Tell your mom that, tell your dad that. It is your divorce you're going through. It's going to affect your children, no matter what age they are, including adult children. But they don't need to be in a position where they are feeling like they have to take sides. And they certainly don't need to be in a position where they are hearing something from one parent about the other parent that makes them uncomfortable. So, to the best of your ability, reframe your parenting as co-parenting, where everything you do is based on what is the best thing for my child or children, what is the best thing for our child or children, rather than telling your own story or promoting yourself. There are other spaces for that if that's what you need to do, but be as respectful as you possibly can and as informed, so they don't feel like they're locked out, but they're not part of this divorce. They're part of the newly shaped family, but they're not part of your financial settlement or who gets what. And then remember that kids are resilient. With proper support, they will get through it. They might get through it stronger. Sometimes if they were in a household where there was a lot of aggression or contention or arguing, they might actually be in a better place. And all of that will depend on what their parents model for them. And another thing, so personal story, when I started going through the divorce process, there was a woman who was an acquaintance friend, you know what I mean? Like we didn't hang together, but she was like 6 months ahead of me in the divorce process. And she invited me to this dinner party with all these other women. And I thought, lovely. There's a lot of social transition you go through in divorce, and looked at it like, oh, this is nice. I will have a circle to go get support from. And I went to that dinner, and it was a very negative experience. There were a lot of women who had been divorced, some of them for 5 or 10 years, and they were still living in that space. They were very much angry and bitter and victim consciousness. And it was a hard space to be in, but also a good realization that this is not what I wanted my life to look like in 5 or 10 years. So I needed to move into a space and find people for me where I both felt supported and held. But they exemplified the life that I wanted to move into. So that's do I want to be in this person's shoes? Do I want to get into I call it drama trauma of divorce, because there are a lot of good stories about divorce. And it is often the first thing people ask, what happened? What happened? You can play there, but if you play there, you're likely to stay there. So think about what I want things to look like when I get through this process. And it's a, like I said, divorce is hard. It's a difficult transition. Life changes a lot. But what do you want that changed life to look like? Do you want to be at that dinner party where people are still talking about their bad experience in their marriage 5-10 years after the marriage is over? Or do you want to be moving on into a life that fulfills you? Be really careful about who's in your circle and who is supporting you through this, because that's going to make a huge difference in your actions and the lens you're looking at your decisions through. Not only friends, but your advisor. So therapist, divorce coach, church, house of worship, who is around you that can support you to do this with the grace and the dignity and information that you covet. I mean, this is your decision. Even if you're not the one asking for the divorce, how you move through the process is your decision. And the more you surround yourself with people who give you good counsel and support and information, the more likely you are to be poised for a better life as you move beyond your divorce. And conversely, if you're with people who are supporting that, dig in and take them for everything they're worth, go spend all the money that you can, hide things. If you're hearing those messages, it's going to impact your process. So be careful with who you surround yourself with, and make sure they're people that support the you that you want to, both be and grow into. And I think that might be it.
Well, we are going to go ahead and take a couple questions right now, and then we'll go ahead and close this out. By the way, Brenda, thank you so much for being here. What a wonderful educational event this has been so far. So here are a couple of questions, and let me just look at my notes here. You talked a lot about gathering information, especially financial information. And then also, okay, this is a separate question, but can you talk a little bit about things people that you see that generally forget about? Like, what are the most common things that people forget about financially?
Oh, that's a really good question. So most of the things that are very top mind are going to be the mortgage. I mean, think of where the big chunks of money or assets are: mortgage, retirement accounts, regular banking accounts, any investment accounts. Things people forget about are the things that we don't see on a regular basis, that we don't get a monthly statement on. So they can be things like I mentioned, stock options. If someone is at a company where they get stock options, part ownership, restricted stock units, bonuses that are kind of off the grid. They might show up somewhere if they're cashed out, but they might not. So that's the kind of thing you want to know to ask the question. And you can say, let's get a complete benefits package from your HR. Whatever human resources is, have them disclose everything that is part of your employment. And then that helps document things that might be not on a paycheck per se. So that could be one. Trying to think of others. HSAs. People know about HSAs, but they don't necessarily look at the HSA as an asset. If someone has been using their HSA, their health savings account, if they're using that as they use an IRA, they could have accumulated a lot of money. And there are people who do that. I mean, our retirement costs for healthcare are projected to be like $250,000 a couple. So people might choose to start socking away money in the HSA that they can use down the road and paying for their healthcare out of pocket now. So you want to look at that statement. Another one is people will leave 401ks at former employers and forget about them, or just kind of set them aside. you're not necessarily, and companies have gotten better about it, but you're not necessarily going to get a statement unless you ask for it, especially now that so many things are online. You might have just been moved into some online portal or dashboard, but unless you go find the former employee or participant finds that, then it's not going to be part of your top of mind statements. Another really important one is pensions. Pensions are few and far between for younger employees now, but there are a lot of people in teaching professions, service professions, and some, more established corporate employers who have a defined benefit pension plan. And you really need to dig deep into those to make sure what you're intending to do, if you're dividing that, can actually be done. Because oftentimes the plan will say, no, we won't do that. So you need to know that before anything is final. You also need to know how they value the value of that account. Because it's possible that even if you ask for a statement, say your spouse has a pension with their employer and you ask for a statement and you get the statement and it says the pension value is $54,000 lump sum. But you keep reading, and on page 3, it says the annual benefit at retirement is $3,500 a month. Those are different values. The lump sum is what they're going to give you if you say, I'm taking my toys and leaving. Here's your allowance. The annual income, that's more likely to be projected out to potentially $1 million in value in income. So you need to look at the statements and know what you're reading. And that's where someone who is well-versed in the finances of divorce can help interpret it, if you will. I recently had a case where there was literally in all their disclosure, there was a 1-page document from a former employer that gave a weekly or a monthly income amount for a pension that was like 10 years old. But following down that rabbit hole, it was worth a lot more. He was 2 employers away from that pension, but was vested. So that was worth about $500,000. It's, so I would suggest, like, hidden things, go back through your marriage. Did you or your spouse switch employers frequently or at all? Did you participate in a retirement account at that old employer, or did they? Are they still in existence? Can you reach out to them and say, hey, I just want to confirm, do we have an account here? Do I have an account here? Do they have an account here? Now, that is one thing where if it's your spouse, you're not going to get any information. They have to be the one to find that information. But as I said, it's most likely that it's all going to get disclosed anyway. Is it going to be disclosed voluntarily, which costs you nothing but the energy it takes to get the statements? Or is it going to be disclosed because you subpoenaed them and filed for discovery and the lawyers spent 5 hours talking about it and it cost you $2,500 to get the same information? And those are decisions that you make. And that's kind of the reality check as you move through this. What is it worth? Is it worth because you're angry withholding the information? Some people might say yes. That is their decision. And our goal in webinars like this is to help people be informed of pros and cons of those decisions.
All right, I think we have time for one more question here. You talked about the environment for telling your spouse that you've decided to exit the marriage. What about like the location environment for telling the kids? And then maybe a follow-up question to that, is it best to tell them as a group or one-on-one if you have more than one child?
I honestly don't feel I can answer that question because every family is individual. In some cases, it may be best to tell them all together. In some cases, it may be best to tell them individually. The one thing I would say is think through the stage that you're setting when you tell the children. If one spouse tells the other, oh, it's going to be better if the kids hear it from you, but they're actually saying, they're the ones saying they want the divorce. That kind of dynamic where one parent feels backed into, I'm doing this because it's best for the children, but it's not my decision. Anything like that, anything that doesn't feel authentic or real or true is likely to come out sideways or backfire down the road. So I'm trying to be thoughtful about this. It really does depend on your situation. If you're not sure how to go about it, or you and your spouse don't agree, I would suggest reaching out to someone who specializes in children's therapy, to give some guidelines. One bit of information that I got way back when was kids don't want things to change. And throwing them into like, you're going to go see a therapist and we're going to, like, all the things are changing, and kind of, pushing it in their face isn't allowing them to process the information they need to process in their own time. So that is another thing to consider. Like, it might be very well intentioned. We're gonna give you all the support we possibly can. Put yourself in their place. Maybe they just need to know that it's ready for them if they ever need it. And that what they need most is to know that they are loved and will be loved, and their parents are putting their needs first, and that their parents will not be playing them against the other parent, or manipulating them, or talking bad about the other parent, or and it can show up in little things. Oh, there it goes again. Your mother is always fill in the blank. Oh, your father is always. Kids hear that stuff. So switching gears to co-parenting and getting out of your family parenting patterns can be really, really important. I kind of didn't answer that question, but I don't feel equipped or knowledgeable enough to answer it. And I don't feel that there is a best answer. I think it depends on your family.
Yeah. Well, and like so many things, it sounds like it's individual, but thank you for your thoughts.
Yeah. And I guess I would add on some of those filters that we talked about for telling your spouse. Think in the same way for your kids. Don't tell your daughter right before she has to leave for volleyball practice. She's going to be a wreck. Make sure that they have time and support and space to process, instead of teeing them up for, oh, they're busy, I'm going to wedge it in here. And then, I'm going on with my day, or letting them go on with their day. And that might seem like it could be a good thing. Like, I'm going to tell them when they're going to be distracted and have other things to do so they can't dwell on it. They probably need to dwell on it. They probably need to sit with it. They probably need to call their best friend. They're going to need space. So I guess the one thing I would say is make sure that they've got that. Try to fit it into their schedule, not yours.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for questions. And I want to thank everyone for being here. We want to thank Brenda for being here and lending her expertise. Look for an email soon for a link to the replay of this event. You're welcome to share that with friends and family. One other thing that people would like to know, probably, we have almost a series now of information about divorce from Brenda, and you can go ahead and probably just type divorce in our recorded webinars on advicechaser.com, and a lot of those and as well as other divorce ones that we've done will pop up. So you're welcome to educate yourself more about that. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners is committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Once again, from Advice Chaser, thank you so much for coming, everyone. And we'll see you at another webinar soon. Talk to you later. Bye, everyone.